Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Play On podcast. This is a new theme for the channel. We're going to start a series of GAA debates. For the first one, I'm joined by Sarah O'Donovan. Sarah, how's it going?
Good. Looking forward to Sunday's game, Cork and Limerick. Still hopeful.
Yeah. Well, this debate is not about Cork versus Limerick. This debate is the first of obviously the series that we're hoping to do. And it is what makes a perfect manager, or what makes close to a perfect manager. Sarah, it's 16 years since you first got onto the Cork senior team, and obviously now you're working with the Dublin ladies as a coach there. And obviously over all the years since 16 years have gone by, there's been a massive change in how my generation has grown up, especially with social media and our access to resources, our access to gyms, to training facilities. What really has been the main thing that you've noticed about, management styles, and how do managers have to adapt to the change in times?
Firstly, the era of the bluffer is over. Because of the amount of information that's available now and the amount of content that's available, both in relation to teams that are successful and in relation to coaching styles. If you're not on top of your game as a manager, you will be called out as a player, because they have all of this information available on the internet that I didn't have at 19 when I was heading into the Cork setup.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense, because there is this kind of prestige that's definitely linked, particularly to players who've been there and done it, players that are All-Ireland winners. But definitely if that particular player has been shown that he doesn't really know, or she doesn't really know what they're talking about, the prestige of meeting them can kind of fade away a little bit.
I think it's probably very obvious that players don't necessarily make great coaches and great managers, and the standards that you set for yourself aren't necessarily the standards that players want to set for themselves, and there can be a level of disappointment there on the part of the coach or the manager that's hard to hide. And equally, from the player's point of view, they have this idea of how they want to play, and they interpret their effort, the way they do their job in a different way that somebody else does, and it can become quite personal. So I would say at a very base level, coaches are not always the best players.
Yeah, and obviously this year was a massive statement. Obviously Mayo beating Dublin last weekend was the real end of an era, but Dessie Farrell's management style contrasting to Jim Gavin's management style, Dublin are a great example in how management really came in and changed everything. And that's the first real topic we'll talk about. So as a manager, in my mind, the first thing that you need to do is you need to build a culture. You need to build a winning culture. You need to build a selfless culture. You need to build one where you are part of the team, not an individual. And the best example that I can see is Dublin in the mid-2000s were a real hype team. They would, they'd win Leinster and they'd play this rock and roll style football. And, the crowd at the Hill in 82,000, it was in the middle of the Celtic Tiger, and there would always be full Croke Parks. They'd get to the big game and they'd fold. And Pat Gilroy came in 2009. And the first thing he did was he began the sleep outs for the homeless. He began, obligatory working at the soup kitchen and everything to kind of ground them, get them more, you're not superstars, you're Dublin footballers, you're giving something to the community. And, making them run at ridiculous hours in the morning. It wasn't about hype, it was about working hard. They weren't really permitted to celebrate in the same way that particularly Tommy Lyons had them celebrating at the start of the 2000s. It eventually led to them being real sturdy, real hard to beat. They worked so hard for the team. And in my mind, they weren't the best team, certainly compared to the Dublin teams that then followed them on. But they won that All-Ireland in 2011, 3 years after Gilroy had taken over. Yeah, that was probably the main example I can think of a manager really coming in and setting a culture from what it had been before.
I think from Pat Gilroy's point of view, he knew he had a talented bunch of players, and what he did was allowed them to realise their full potential. And that's something that has to be commended. In order to realise their full potential, they had to leave their egos at the door in one sense, but he also showed them what they were good at, and they made themselves better.
Yeah, well, what happened there was as well as that, back in the mid-2000s, Dublin would get gassed up as if they were better than teams, particularly even in Gilroy's first year when, he came in. I remember that was the year where Kerry were looking a little bit on the ropes. And I remember the hype before that game. You would think Dublin were going to blow Kerry away. And then Kerry battered Dublin. I think it finished 124-17. It was just an awful game to watch. And Dublin never got going. 2008 was the same. He got destroyed by Mickey Hart's Tyrone in a quarter-final that we were very, very hyped up to win. Gilroy put their feet on the ground as well. Like, they knew that they were good, but they didn't think that they were better than anybody before the game began. And this was back in the day. I know that you're saying about, players like a Paul Flynn and a Dermot Connolly, they obviously very talented. But this was a Dublin team that struggled to win Leinster. They lost Leinster in 2010. Meath put 5 goals past them in the Leinster semi-final. And 2011, they struggled against Kildare. They got that last-minute free to put them into the Leinster final, which was very, very contentious to say the least. They just about beat Wexford in the Leinster final. Then they come to life, beat Tyrone, beat Donegal, and then beat Kerry. Particularly the Donegal and Kerry game were just pure hard grit, hard work. They never gave up. They were low-scoring games. They were tough games. Compare it to 112 to 111 is a low-scoring enough game, in my opinion.
I agree.
But I think Dublin, back then, they were a real rugged, hard-working team. He played wing forwards that were more workhorses, the likes of Brian Cullen, did a lot of dirty work. Barry Cahill started centre-half forward in that final. He wasn't a forward. He was there to do dirty work. Whereas now with players like Kieran Kilkenny and stuff like that, they're not there to do dirty work. Niall Scully is probably the man who moves the ball around a bit like a Brian Cullen would have. Dublin, they really wrung it out, like got every bit of talent that they had, and they got that All Ireland. And then Jim Gavin came in, and the culture that he set after took it to a new level, in my opinion.
I think that the analysis piece that has come into play in terms of GAA, I think that the video analysis, the statisticians, the volume of information that came into football around the time that Gavin came into football changed the way that Dublin played as well, because you saw the style of play change, and you'll talk about percentage shots and only kicking ball in scoring ranges. All of that changed because of the amount of information that became available by having these guys monitor games and review games. And, it's a different team, even in the space of 3 years. The level of information that is available to Jim Gavin then was available to Pat Gilroy changed the way his team played the sport. So it's not even about culture. It's about the amount of information that became available.
I agree, but Gavin definitely brought a lot of the military background that he has. He brought that into the Dublin camp. He really made them punctual, part of a process, in his own words. And If you speak to anyone now who's a Dublin underage player, they're very quickly swallowed into this process mentality, which Gavin definitely overarches. And that's his legacy, in my opinion, as well as the 5 in a row.
It's a very positive legacy to have. I don't know if it's impacting at underage level the way they thought it would, as evidenced by the fact that Offaly are under 20 champions and Dublin also lost the minor. I think there's a certain element of process that's required, but you also need players with talent, skill, ego. Work will get you so far, and then you need your talent, you need your ego as well. So there's going to be elements of Jim Gavin's process that will survive, and then they will have to look at the playbook and look at ways of bringing up players who have the skill set that those Offaly players showed at the weekend. I don't think we've seen as forward thinking a team as we saw from Offaly on Sunday.
Yeah, no, I agree. And definitely it is about creating a culture, but the players do have to be there as well. But sometimes a great manager shows the great players. And that's what I mean, is that Dublin, they had the Brogans before, which everyone knew were good, but they went to new levels under Pat Gilroy. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. We'll talk about 2 more people that I really think were standard bearers when you come to setting the culture. particularly for changing the culture that had been there before. I think Brian Cody from Kilkenny is, absolutely one of the best managers of all time, if not the best. And Jim McGuinness in Donegal, I think the way he changed Donegal from a team that were ranked number 19 when he took over to All-Ireland champions in 2 seasons is remarkable.
I agree with you on both. Brian Cody's interesting because the players who have played under Brian never felt the love that the fans felt for Brian. They admired him greatly, but I don't know if they ever had relationships with him beyond the pitch. Not saying that a manager needs to have a relationship with his players, but the retirement of Liam Sheedy this week, it was evident that some players were very comfortable about, discussing Brian or discussing Liam and, impressing upon everyone how Liam had helped them, both personally and on the pitch. So Liam is probably the friendlier of the two. Brian, an incredibly successful man, but the autobiographies that have come out from the likes of Jackie Tyrrell, David Herity has spoken about the ruthlessness. There must be a happy medium between Brian Cody and Liam Sheedy.
Yeah, and Eamon Ryan is another good example. The Cork manager obviously put in a real winning mentality there with Cork when he took over, but he definitely had a bit of a softer attitude towards the players, I'd say.
He did, and they said that he never actually let anyone go. They always knew when their time was up. He had a great way of filtering them out without ever having any of those conversations. And that's something which has to be admired as well. I know that Breed Stack had said that, and I spoke to Annie Walsh about it as well. And that was the case, that there was never that ruthless streak. It was just inferred by the way Eamon picked his teams that you were either very close or you weren't there at all. And then it was your decision whether you wanted to stay and fight or whether you decided to leave.
Yeah, and that definitely is interesting. I think when you mentioned Liam Sheedy as well, his management style, his man management, there was that famous scene, that famous clip where he has his arm around John O'Dwyer at the water break and he's kind of putting the arm around the shoulder and, come on, John, you can do better. And then he goes over to Seamus Callan and he's really pushing him hard in the chest. He's giving him little punches and stuff, and he's really trying to rile up Seamus Callan, and he seems to know what worked for different players.
And look, that comes with time, I suppose from our own point of view with Dublin, Adrian and Donny are in with us this year for the first time as a group. And by next year, I imagine, they'll be very familiar with the players and will be much more comfortable now in the off season, speaking to the players and getting the most out of the players. You certainly need a season under your belt to get used to the players. And maybe that's the issue with Dessie Farrell. Last season was so short because of COVID. This season obviously began so late because of COVID. He hasn't had the same time to bed in that Jim Gavin had previous to him.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that COVID has definitely changed the game for every single manager, particularly Pádraig Joyce with Galway. He's the one that I look at and think Galway were really rolling before the pandemic hit. Pádraig Joyce's attacking style of football was really taking the country by storm, and then the pandemic hit and Galway really lost the steam that they initially had. The other culture setter definitely was Jim McGuinness. He took over a real losing team there in Donegal. They were used to getting beaten every year in the biggest game. And 2 years later, he has them as All-Ireland champions. I watched his documentary. I've read his book. I think he's a fascinating manager. I think he's a fascinating man, to be honest. The things he's been through, the way he's been shaped into who he is, that he was very interested in the psychological side of his players. And he really wanted to plant the psychological seed in them that they are winners. He talked on his documentary about how every day he'd go in and he'd tell the team, we're going to be All-Ireland champions. We're going to be All-Ireland champions. We're going to be Ulster champions. We're going to beat Tyrone. We're going to win Ulster. Just planting the seeds constantly. And I think that's definitely an interesting side of the game. Do you think that's a must with managers, or do you think it comes from the players?
I think there has to be an element of buy-in from both sides. So the manager has to believe that there is potential there, but equally the players have to, and no more than me, the last Sunday in the ladies' football, there has to be a bravery there that, right, you're not sure how much my commitment will actually improve this team, but I'm going to give it everything and not be afraid of the result. I think some teams have a tendency to say, God, I'm not going to overcommit here because wouldn't that be a waste of time? Whereas that Meath team last Sunday committed everything and came out with the whole reward, a first ever senior ladies football final. And I don't think watching the game that you could say anything other than the fact that they laid it all on the line, committed everything they had, and came out with the result.
Exactly, and that's a massive achievement, obviously, for them. And a lot of that came from sheer belief and obviously the talent of players like Vicky Wall and stuff like that.
But bravery as well, Seamus, because there's lots of teams can be brave, leave it all on the line. I'm thinking about Derry this year in the Ulster Football Championship. I thought they were incredible and they lost the game, by a point. Had so many chances, but literally threw the kitchen sink at the game. And I really enjoyed that game and they were incredibly brave. Bravery is critically something that a team that doesn't necessarily get the results has to bring to the pitch first.
But does it take bravery? Like, I know it takes bravery to go for it, but can bravery often be a little bit naive or a little bit stupid if you're going to go out against a team? Like, for example, Donegal in 2011, they weren't as talented as Dublin, but the way that they set up, I know it wasn't pretty at all, believe me. I was at that game, it was horrible to watch. But they knew if we play 15 on 15 against Dublin, they'll kill us. So we need to think up of a way in which we can get our lower level of talent, but bring Dublin down and make them play our game. I know that it's being brave and stuff, but at the same time, you don't want to play the game on the terms that the other team are going to win on.
When I'm talking about bravery, I'm talking about the manager coming saying, I think he can win it. The players buying into the fact that if we actually go for this and give 110%, we can win it. Even if we don't win it, we've taken the team as far as we can. That there's a bravery in that. There's lots of teams that I have been involved with, never believed or were never brave enough to consider what their full commitment would result in. They half committed because they felt that it would be a waste of time if they actually gave their full commitment because they weren't going to win anyway. So we're talking about Jim McGuinness coming into training every day and saying, you're going to win. I believe you can win. I believe you can win. That has to be matched by the players saying, you think we can win. We think we can win. Let's go for it. See how far we can get.
Oh, they're emptying it all into training and stuff like that. You mean that, say for smaller counties like a Leitrim, if they're going out saying we can win the Connacht Championship, but the players like deep down don't think that they can at all. Is that what you're kind of saying there?
I'm asking for bravery in the sense that I want everybody in the team to commit to give the maximum of themselves to see how far they can bring themselves up to the bar. There's a realization there that you can only go so far, but you'll find with lots of lower level teams that the players won't have committed to even get to their own maximum level, not mind the team's maximum level. So Meath were on off the ball on Monday, and I think Emma Duggan spoke about no team being willing to play Meath this year in the Senior Ladies Football Championship because they didn't think Meath were good enough or would be worth their while. They could have easily shut down on that basis, but they decided to throw the kitchen sink at it and see how far they could get.
Yeah.
A quarter final could have been a great place for Meath to land in their first year at senior, but they decided to throw everything at it and see where they could get to. And that's what I'm saying about those lower level teams. It's not about necessarily winning the All-Ireland, but it's about a manager coming in and saying, we're going to get the absolute maximum out of this team. We don't know what the maximum is, but we're going to try and get there.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying there. I agree that when a team goes for it, they have much more of an opportunity. But to get that level of bravery, which we're going to go on to now, is the next massive thing for a manager, which is man management and their relationship with the players. Players won't go the extra mile for a manager that they don't like, in my opinion. And that's honestly from my experience as well. If you want to jump through a brick wall for your manager, you will do anything for them if they have a good relationship with the players. But as we've talked about, the days as well. I think the days of ruling through fear as well are gone. The days you look at Sir Alex Ferguson with Manchester United, the players were actually a little bit afraid of him. I think those days are gone now, because I think, as you've said, there's much more access, and players can leave the panel and make an autobiography and talk about how, horrible it was to play under this manager and everything like that. Times have changed there.
They have changed big time. I think that I agree with you on ruling with an iron fist. It's unnecessary, ruling through fear, unnecessary. I think that players now want information. Okay, so they want to know how many possessions they had, how many tackles they gave. They want to know what their position or role looks like to the manager, to see if they can actually achieve their ability in that role. So as a manager, I don't think it's necessarily about players liking you in one sense, but I think there has to be a level of honesty there now. In previous years, yes, players would have played under different managers because that's all they had in terms of information. Okay, so you were relying on your manager because he was the only one who knew how you could play or whether you were going to play the game that day, right? It was his choice. If you look at the setup for Sunday, say with Cork and Limerick, so the Cork team has a team of maybe 6 analysts who work with the players individually about the way they're playing, about what they're doing well, about what they're doing poorly. They can talk to the manager, they can talk to the coaches. The idea of the manager being the overarching person in all of this now, it's not the same as in the 90s or the noughties. There's lots of opinions, which is really good, which is really positive. The players can look to 5 or 6 different avenues within the setup for feedback, and then they can build their case about playing or not playing on that feedback. I think something that is not healthy is that a manager comes in for 3 years, sets their agenda, and then leaves. And then a group of players who have invested wholeheartedly into this agenda have to start all over again with a new manager and actually have to engage again, create a relationship, create a bond, and they're tired. So that idea that the manager is having a relationship with the players, yes, but I think it has to be a tempered relationship, in that it's not a case of I'll play for him, I'll die for him. The manager and the players have to understand that there's a process, as Jim Gavin would have said, and there's a structure. And if you hit these targets as a team, you will always win regardless of the manager.
Yeah, I believe that. I believe that Dublin, for a while anyway, obviously they'd been shook a little bit, but they looked like they had an overarching philosophy, which no matter who's in the hot seat, Dublin kind of managed themselves, especially when Dessie Farrell, the reaction when Dessie Farrell got suspended for a while was absolutely nothing's going to change because Dessie Farrell got suspended. They could put anyone from Mick Deegan to Paul Clark in there and nothing will change. They have their way of playing, which they know. But now a lot of people following that result, this is the third one that we're going to talk about, is playing style. Because after that Mayo match, a lot of people now are saying Dessie needs to establish the way that he wants to play. You can't play Jim Gavin's football for Dessie Farrell because he's not that type of manager. He's not as good at it as Jim Gavin was. So he needs to establish what type of football he wants to play and not the process. A lot of people are saying that. And now I don't necessarily agree with it. I think Dublin just kind of ran out of gas this year. But it is an interesting perspective what style of play you want to implement. As we spoke with Jim McGuinness as well, he made them very hard to beat in his first year. He made them very defensive, very structured, very organised. They won the Ulster Championship. They started to believe that they were a winning team. And then the following year, he introduces a more attacking style of football, and then they win the All-Ireland. Their style of play, in my mind, it has to be rigid to the manager in terms of he knows what he's about or she knows what she's about. But then they have to also be willing to adapt with the times, especially the best example I can give is Jim Gavin, 2013, Dublin won the All-Ireland with a very rock and roll style football, very attacking, very direct, aggressive. Kerry picked them apart in the first half of that 2013 semi-final, Colin Cooper especially. Then Donegal took them to the cleaners in 2014 on the counter-attack. And that's when Jim Gavin said, right, time to change everything, put Cian O'Sullivan back there as a sweeper, and Dublin obviously went on to do the 5 in a row from that point. So I think knowing your style of play, but also being willing to adapt with the times and adapt with the new structures that are coming in with other teams is a vital part of being a manager.
So Desi doesn't have the players that Jim Gavin had at the start of 2015.
I agree with that. I agree. It was a much better team.
Yes, a much better individual group of players with very different skills. I thought Tommy Conroy on Saturday night, and the points that he kicked were absolutely insane. I don't think any footballer on the Dublin team at that point would have been willing to take the risks that Tommy took to kick those scores. Would you agree or disagree?
I agree completely, but I don't think it's because of the players themselves. I think the players are so bet into the process now for Dublin that they're too scared to take a shot which is not a percentage shot. The shots that Tommy Conroy took, apart from the one where he ran straight through in extra time and put it over the bar, the other shots that he took were not, high percentage
shots.
Yeah, which Dublin wouldn't have taken those shots on. And I still think Kieran Kilkenny, Con O'Callaghan, these guys are more than capable of kicking points from tough distances, but they're not given the permission to go for it. And I think that can sometimes stifle a player's quality.
So do you think that stifling came from Jim, or do you think it came from Des?
I think it came more from Jim. I think Jim put it in initially, but they were still managing to work shots. They still had more leaders in the team that were willing to say, right, I'll take the shot on now. You're bringing through a lot of young lads now. You're bringing through a lot of Colin Basquels. You're bringing through a lot of Aaron Burns, Sean Buglers, young lads who are only new into the team. And they're not as confident to say, I'm going to break this chain of Dublin possession, which is almost 2 minutes long every time. I'm going to break this chain of possession to have a shot. I'd say most of the shots that Dublin took against Mayo were by Dean Rock, Kieran Kilkenny, or Con O'Callaghan. Most people didn't have the bottle to take a shot because they don't want to be the one to miss. Whereas back when Jim initially brought it in, everyone on that team was a captain, if you like, and would have had the courage to say, right, this is the right time to take a shot. I know it is. And they'd go for it. Whereas now the players are so rigid on, we have to wait for the best chance to shoot, that sometimes they miss one that's right in front of them.
So process isn't necessarily the best scenario for a group of players like that with an abundance of talent.
It's not always, in my opinion, because Dublin hung onto the ball for 2 minutes at a time and wouldn't score. Mayo would then get the ball off them, one kick pass, and they'd have a shot at the post. And whether it would go wide or whether it would go over, they'd be a lot more threatening to Dublin, I think, than hanging onto the ball for such a long time, because Dublin weren't getting goals by doing that. And their way of doing it, of hanging onto the ball for so long, means that they keep Mayo in the game. They dominated the first quarter and they were only 3 points up. The old Dublin team would have been up by about 6 or 7, at least.
Agree. So I think a manager has to find the balance between allowing his players to express themselves so that they are encouraged to use the talent that they have, that their ego is encouraged to take the shots that they potentially can score, and also that they are doing the best for the team at that particular point in time. So on Saturday night, Kieran Kilkenny in his head possibly could have said, this doesn't feel right to me for the team right now. I'm going to step up here and I'm going to go on a solo run. And because I know I have the talent and I've proved this for 45 games, I'm going to rip up the playbook and get us over the line. But he didn't. Would Diarmuid Connolly have done something different on Saturday night if he was the guy in that spot?
I think Diarmuid Connolly would definitely have been given more license to do it than a Kieran Kilkenny, because Diarmuid Connolly is 1 in a million in terms of his absolute talent that he has. But Dublin now, they have more of a robotic style to them. And what was clear when you have a process as well. And I will definitely put this down. Once you have a process, often there's no plan B. And I mean, this is that when it was going up in smoke, and when Mayo went that 3 points ahead, all of a sudden Dublin went back to the most basic football I've ever seen from them, just kicking the ball into the square. Brian Fenton kicked the ball straight to Lee Keegan. Dublin just panicked because they realized this hanging onto the ball, it isn't working. So now we've got to get it in fast. And because they were trying to just get it in fast, they weren't looking where they were kicking it. They were just kicking it. And Mayo were just like, all right, we're just going to throw Lee Keegan back in front of the full back line and he's just going to sweep up all day. It was the same thing in 2011 in the semi-final, Dublin against Donegal. The second that Dublin went 1 point ahead of Donegal, the game was over because Donegal had built their whole system, their whole process around, we're going to get a little bit ahead of Dublin and we're just going to hold on. And the second that Dublin got ahead of them, it was over because they banked so much on their process.
I think the role of the manager is incredibly hard now.
Yeah.
But I do think the modern player, the 19, 20, 21-year-old is going to look for more from a manager than just, let's go out and get a result today, lads, because that's not how performances are earned. There's a process in terms of building, but you also have to remember that players have unique talents and these have to be fostered by a manager and his coaching team. And sometimes what's right for one player is not always right for another player. What I would say is for future managers, information is key, and video analysis, player feedback, self-criticism. So they, and when I say criticism, I mean critique. So they get to look at their own videos. They get to see how they're moving, their decision making. And if you put all of those things in front of a player and you show them their game and you suggest different things to change about their game, when they can see that in real time and are looking at a TV screen, you're going to get a lot more positive buy-in from a player. But if you're discussing something with them that they can't visualize and that they can't see, they're not going to buy into it.
Exactly. And that was one of the key things about managers that I've heard from interviews with players and stuff, is that a manager needs to tell a player why they need to do certain things.
But it makes absolute sense. You know, there's pillars of performance that every team has. They don't necessarily know that those pillars exist because some managers have never delved into that side of the game. But I think as more and more players become educated by different teams, by different sports stars, by the amount of information that's available on the internet, on social media, they're going to look for managers to be very clear and straightforward about how we can win games, how I can make my position on the pitch, how I can keep my position on the pitch. And if I'm not playing, how do I get from the other side of the white line to a jersey?
Mm-hmm. And at the forefront of, what makes a good manager, you have to make the players want to be on your side. And you have
to make the players want to play for the team. Like, and I can't stress this enough, having been involved with so many different teams over the years. Managers come and go. Managers will always come and go. But it's your teammate who you've played with in the trenches for a period of, 15 years up through the grades with Dublin, is the player that you're going to look to in the heat of battle. So it's very important that the players are willing to play for the team. The manager is responsible for building the team. But
I get
their time is finite. Like, their time is finite, Seamus. Like,
yeah, but how then, when a manager comes in, how does a manager best complement the team that's already there?
So I think from my experience, the best scenario is to ask players what didn't work before and put in place an environment that has these things. So a training pitch, a home venue, food after training, a physio, expenses paid, when you're traveling for games, because that's what the county board have agreed to. These are all at obviously inter-county level. These are things that would have been absent previously. okay, gear for new members of the panel, little things, so that the team joins together and that the team feels heard.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for a manager outright to get buy-in, they have to be shown to be working for the team, not for themselves.
Yeah. So expenses.
These may seem like simple things, but if you don't have a pitch to train in on a Wednesday and you're getting a phone call at 4:00 to tell you where you're going to training, then that's going to obviously set the whole thing out of kilter. And that's what you're dealing with certain teams in Dublin. Whereas this year, there's been a great effort to make sure that all of this scheduling was done in advance so players could plan their lives, you know?
Mm-hmm. It's showing basic respect as well to the players' time, and it's making it that they can have lives as well as that. And I think that's one of the key things when you're talking about being a unit as a team. I think especially managers have to understand, say if there's players on the team that have kids, or if there's players in the team that have families or jobs, or they have to go traveling or something like that. I think that's important as well for a manager to understand that some players as well, they've different interests, or they've a different way of being, or they're different personalities. And I think that's massively important if you want to create a unit, a real unit. You can't have players who are in that dressing room on that team that deep down they feel like outsiders.
I agree. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do in an amateur environment. When you have a professional environment, say like a soccer team, all of those players have come through the ranks in the same way. They've, gotten contracts at 16, 17. They've been in that environment forever. For amateur groups, it's even more difficult. So for a manager to be able to allow 30 different humans to express themselves and not feel like they're different is a big challenge. But certainly meeting everyone at the pitch gate and saying, here on the pitch, you will only be judged on, your performance on the pitch. So, if you bring that commitment to the pitch, we can see that. I think that gives players a level playing field.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely understand as well. And then to tap into that even further, does that mean that, rigid systems like a Brian Cody with Kilkenny, does that mean that they will start to go out of fashion a little bit, because it's no longer the manager getting all the love, it's a real unit type, and managers now have to kind of bow to that, whereas Brian Cody's army system with Kilkenny, is that becoming a little bit outdated in your opinion?
I think younger players will look for more. I would love to know what the Offaly footballers have, I suppose, looked for in their management in the last 3 years. And maybe that would be great content for you for a couple of weeks' time if you get one of the Offaly lads on board.
Yeah.
I'm 36, and, I suppose the things that I accepted as a player, I wouldn't necessarily accept now, having experienced coaching and management in the last kind of 6 months.
Yeah, no, I would be fascinated to get one of them on, because it's been, a real fairy tale of the year, their success. Is there anything else that, factors in for me being able to bring people into your unit when they're young lads is massively important, to my opinion. I think you need real captains, real team leaders, as well as having a good coaching and management structure.
That's very important, especially with minors coming through and under 20s coming through. Captains and people within the senior setup have to be able to say to these players, there will be a period of transition, but you will get there. We've all been in the same boat as you. We didn't have an academy system growing up like Dennis Perkamp has, where we've all had to go the hard way. So don't be discouraged by the fact that you feel like you're so far away from the pack right now.
Yeah. And that definitely is an interest in it. Captains. I had Kieran Coffey on as well, and he's a Wicklow under 20 footballer, or he was, and he was saying one of the key moments was when he first came into that panel, and the older lads in the team were very nice to him. They were very kind of, he's a young lad, but they really made him feel like one of them. And Sean Foran said the same thing when I interviewed him about he got onto the Dublin under 20s when he was still, a minor for Whitehall. And he said about, the older lads, the likes of Owen O'D and Neil Matthews, that they really kind of embraced him into the team, and that definitely made him feel like one of the team, because especially when they're a young lad, if they have an icy relationship with the team, it's very easy for them to go. It's very easy for them to go traveling or do something else with their life while they're still young. And then you might never get them back.
That's the sad scenario of this. You'll obviously have a situation next year where the airports will open up and there'll be a cohort of players who put in a massive effort this year will run for the hills. It's trying to find that happy balance between telling them that it's worth it and allowing them to live their lives, because they are amateur players at the end of the day.
Yeah. So to kind of recap on it, if there's someone listening now, Sarah, who is just about to become a manager, really of any level, if they're about to become a manager of a club team, if they're about to become a manager of a senior team or an inter-county team, and they're listening right now to this, what would be, your best advice that you could give to them about being a manager of the team?
I would say that transparency is key. So if they are taking over the role, they're going to have a group of players who have been in the system or in that group for a period of time, who have already decided the things that need to be changed. And a discussion with those players at the outset about those things is critical. There is no point going in with your own plan and trying to put it onto a culture or a group of players that have experienced different things. Everyone has to be coming at it from the same point of view. So yes, there's things that need to be corrected. Some of those things mightn't be able to be changed immediately, but let's work together and see what we can change now and see what we can change as we go along. Mm-hmm. Don't go in assuming that you know what's right for that group of players, because you don't.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found fascinating about what Sean told me is that their message, the Dublin players' message, is progress over perfection. And every year that they try and just progress, because in his words, you're never going to play the perfect game. And they're always looking to progress. And I think that's a good message to come in with, that every year you get better. Every game you get better. Every training session you get a little bit better.
Exactly. And that's important. You won't necessarily ever get the perfect game, but there's great joy in working towards something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so well said. Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Seamus.
All right. Thanks, guys, for listening to this episode of the Play On podcast. Don't forget, there's more of these teams coming. Let me know if you think of any teams that you would find interesting if we were to do any. And yeah, thanks for listening to the podcast, and take care.